Welcome, everyone, to Illuminating the Future Through an Equity Lens. I'm Jewlya Lynn, and I'm joined by Jen. We're both deeply in the complexity and systems change space, and we're going to share more about our background in a minute, but first I'm going to tell a story. So a few years ago, I was on a virtual call with a group of innovative funders. They were calling in from afar. They were sitting in a little Airbnb on the seaside, and they were doing their quarterly convening to check in about this innovative work they were doing. They were really trying something they had never tried before. We were about 6 months into working together. We were learning all of these amazing things. We were discovering more and more commonality in how they talked about the change that was possible through this innovation. And so I said to them in the midst of this really interesting conversation about what we were learning, I think you might be ready to develop a theory of change. For those who aren't familiar with that term, a theory of change is a fairly linear prediction of how we believe change will happen and what our piece of it is. So in that moment, I said that line and they hung up on me. Now, it turns out it was a technical issue, but while I was waiting to learn that, I found myself thinking about why are they reacting so negatively to this idea of predicting their pathway to change. In fact, I actually found myself deciding in that moment that I made a mistake. Theory of change wasn't the right tool. So they were describing a future. Their work was beginning to describe a future in really exciting ways about how they wanted to advance change in a very complex system. And so I had reached into my toolbox of tools and I found a theory of change, the tool for describing a desired future. Some of you may have learned to use more traditional strategic planning tools, visions, goals, outcomes, objectives. Maybe you even use logic models or log frames. But essentially, all of these tools are doing the same thing. They're predicting a pathway to the future. In that moment, while waiting on them, I also realized there were other more powerful tools for describing the future. Foresight tools. Foresight tools are the very practical methodologies for envisioning the future and for doing futures thinking. And foresight tools, one of the beautiful things about them is they don't attempt to predict one future. Rather, they ask how the future might unfold in multiple different ways. They help us to account for our very limited ability to predict in highly complex settings, and specifically how to predict in an emergent system. In other words, at that moment, I began to ask this question: how do I stop helping my partners predict a future? How do I start helping them predict the complexity of the future so that they can actually participate in helping it unfold in the ways they desire, regardless of what is emerging? And now I'm beginning to realize my other question I should have been asking in that moment is, how do I do this in ways that don't risk feeling elitist, disconnected, inappropriate, even misaligned with the values of the people I'm working with and the communities that they come from and are serving?
Okay, so before Jewlya actually starts to answer those questions for all of us, I'm going to jump in here and give just a really brief background on what we mean when we say the complexity of the future. So we're starting from the assumption that the present right now is very complex. And so it follows that the future will also be really complex. By that, we mean that human nature is unpredictable, that people don't always behave in perfectly rational ways, and that given a set of constraints, people will make different choices. So right now, the COVID vaccine is a really good example of this. So when we say we're interested in systems and systems change, we're acknowledging that things don't happen in isolation. So there's lots of ways to describe systems. Systems sometimes look like interactions between people, like a family can be a system, or they are big structures like politics or healthcare, or they can be even an interaction of big structures, like the UN has a bunch of sovereign member states. So when we say a problem is a systems level problem, we really mean that no one intervention can fix it. So for example, homelessness as a problem has its roots in many different systems: family life, employment, social supports like healthcare, mental health, criminal justice, drug use, et cetera, et cetera. So we can see from that homelessness example that systems are also interconnected and they're nested within each other. Okay, so one more thing. Folks who specialize in systems and complexity tend to talk a lot about emergence. So the general idea of emergence is that if the present is complex and the future is unpredictable, instead of trying to predict it, we're actually better off forgetting that goal altogether and creating interventions where we pay really close attention to what's happening as the result of our actions, what emerges, and then take the next wise action based on that. So actually, this is a picture of Anna from Frozen 2, for those of you who don't know. In the complexity world, there's no better mascot for emergence than Anna. She sings a song called The Next Right Thing, and I've actually seen it played in several kind of complexity places. So we call her our mascot these days. Another metaphor we generally use when we're working in complexity and systems and emergence is that we're using a compass rather than a map. So we have a goal in mind and we keep it in mind as a guiding star, but we're not exactly sure how we're going to get there. Okay, that's all for the definitions. Back over to you, Jewlya.
Great. All right, back to this foresight thing with all those definitions in mind. So I've had the space and time to begin to explore how to bring foresight into my own work. But before we go any further into this discussion, Jen and I want to be clear about something. We have background in foresight tools, but we're not experts in the specific tools that break out of the more Western facts, the decolonized foresight tools that we're sharing today. For the last 9 years, I've been deploying foresight tools in the context of strategy designs, learning practices, evaluations, and I've trained others on their use. But for much of that time, my practice was solidly in the Western methods. I've since started exploring alternative ways of understanding the future, and they're exciting, and I'm just starting this work. When Jen and I began talking about the methods, it was in this context of wanting to open a dialogue with others who are exploring these practices and starting to use them, to be in conversation and learn together. Interest in the dialogue has taken off, and we've continued to share some of what we're seeing and exploring. Our goal is to connect more people into this fascinating work, to open a door to bring us all down a road together. So today, we are the curators of our learning journey. Our goal is to spark your imagination, spark your curiosity, so that you can seek the experts and learn with us. So with that in mind, we are going to first just cover a very key concept. What exactly is a decolonized methodology, whether we're talking foresight or any other method? Let's be clear what we're getting away from. Colonization is when a dominant group or a system takes over and exploits and extracts from the land and its native people. Second, we're going to acknowledge how Western methods, they colonize. Western research methods, research and evaluation, and even strategy. These are not unbiased, innocent pursuits of knowledge. In Western methodologies, our surveys, our interviews, our observations, our group processes, we have this habit of extracting information about people, their experiences, and then taking ownership of how to understand and present back their knowledge. We hold the power to define what is seen and how it's interpreted. In strategy design methods, we hold the power in even greater ways. We are the gatekeepers. Those with the resources to deploy decide what the boundaries are, what the future is, the desired future, where to put the resources, and how change ought to happen. Decolonized methodologies shift that power. They shift the power over defining, designing, implementing. They reposition those who have been the subjects of Western methods as instead the questioners and critics, the theorists, the knowers, the designers, and ultimately the communicators and implementers of their own visions. In the context of foresight, the set of methods that are about exploring the future, decolonized methodologies are coming from the people who are embedded in non-white and non-Western cultures. They're coming from people who approach storytelling about the future more intersectionally and holistically than has been historically done. So with that in mind, I'm going to pass the mic to our first group of experts. These are at Greenpeace, and we're going to share a video that brings to life a very different way of envisioning the future. And get ready, we're going to ask you to react to it.
We already know what we're fighting against, but what do you see when you look forward to the future we're fighting for?
This is an invitation invitation to take intentional time
to reimagine what the future we're fighting for looks like,
what it sounds like,
and what it feels like.
Because in order to build a better world,
we have to visualize it first.
3 sessions to practice playing in beautiful messiness.
3 sessions that will hold our individual visions for a more just future
while creating a collective one.
First, we'll each send a photo of an item that has given us strength, reminded us of our power, or simply brought us joy.
It can be anything. A rock, a trinket, a photo.
With each item, we'll build a kind of collective altar.
Then, for each workshop, we'll write our vision for that week's theme on a placard.
Finally, we'll manifest that vision in whatever way resonates and share it with the group.
It can be through song, dancing, building, or any other way that you want to express your vision.
It's not about being an expert.
It's about being free to be our whole selves.
We know that the fight for our future is an interrelated one.
So we will imagine a future with racial justice,
with gender justice, and with environmental justice.
Don't miss this amazing opportunity to be a part of a workshop series that will both inspire you and help guide our movements to a better, more just world.
The application process ensures that the folks with the least access and privilege to spaces where they can sit in the magic of deep visioning and imagining are prioritized.
Specifically, Black, Brown, and Indigenous women, trans, and non-binary folks.
Through creating this revolutionary space,
we will paint our whole selves into the story.
We will fill in the blanks with our own truths and struggles,
and together we will build
the future that we're fighting for.
I love that video. In this video, they are asking a question. They're asking, what do you see? So I want you to ask yourselves the same question. And we're going to have these types of reflections throughout today's presentation. The goal is to help you spend some time thinking about what you're hearing. As you are doing that, I'm going to tell you another story. About 7 years ago, I did a scenario mapping process. It was a launching point for a field-wide emergent strategy in healthcare advocacy. And it began with about 6 people telling their stories about the future. Some of the stories were very political. Others were more personal. Some were grounded in community experience, and others were very much about influence and power. The stories fed into a larger process and eventually led to a set of scenarios that became part of our shared work together. It was something we revisited as a community about every 6 months. They replaced the need for a strategic plan, for a theory of change, or a logic model. These scenarios gave us a roadmap to explore where we were going and our progress against it. And yet, they weren't as powerful as the stories about the world that could have come to light from a process like the one we just saw. If the strategy design had been grounded in more deeply personal stories, the stories about who the future helps and harms, what the future might hide and make visible, instead of the stories about political and policy context, I imagine our work together would have been much more deeply focused on the people we were trying to serve, not just the systems we were trying to change. We would have asked questions that focused on the experience of those who were being harmed and hopefully helped, instead of focusing on the policies and our intent on what the policies would change. Jen, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jewlya, and thanks, Tanya, for playing along. Tanya says community is what she sees, and that really resonates deeply with me. Okay, so hopefully at this point we have caught your attention. So we just want to take a moment to introduce ourselves and why we're here in front of you today. We are 2 white American cis-presenting people who generally fit into the dominant narratives and structures of privilege, at least here in the US. So we both consider our strategy work to be focused around principles of complexity and equity and seeking to bring about systems change. We both support social change agents to deploy emergent strategies amid complexity. Neither of us pretends to be an expert on decolonized futures, Our goal here is to share with you some of the strands of Decolonized Futures work we've found most useful in broadening our own professional toolkits, be it for developing strategy for a new program or evaluating the effectiveness of a project. So because these innovations in Decolonized Futures have been happening for decades, mostly by Black, Indigenous, and people of color, we say BIPOC, thinkers from around the world, our goal here is to pass the mic to a few well-known folks in the field. So we really think about ourselves as on this learning journey together. We want to raise awareness about this work and absolutely not claim any of it as our own. So we want to reflect together about how it's opened up our eyes to new opportunities in systems change work, including complexity-aware evaluation, emergent strategy, and program design, and ongoing monitoring and learning for programs. So our hope is that by the end of this hour, we will have provided a few opportunities for your own ideas to grow, where you'll be able to identify places where you can recognize the value of and advocate for decolonized futures methods at all the points in a strategy design and implementation, including explicitly in emergent strategies. So we really tried actually to take a decolonized approach to the preparation of the presentation itself. Namely, we sought to listen to others, to highlight multiple ways of knowing, and to decenter Western conceptions. So in creating this presentation, we reached out to several BIPOC futurists and other BIPOC professionals with a decolonized practice, and we asked them to share in their own words what this field means to them. We really want to thank everyone who's contributed to this short amount of time we get to spend with you, and we'll be thanking them by name at the end, along with providing some resources they shared and helped us compile. So for me, where the rubber really hits the road is in the confluence of the anthro-complexity and equity thinking in systems change work. So Jewlya and I are currently finishing an essay with our colleague Tanya Beer on this subject of complexity and equity. So that's coming soon, and we'll let you know when it comes out. In the essay, we critically examine questions around power, including who owns the creation of theories of change and whose vision is baked into program design and desired outcomes, and how much we can actually predict those outcomes and pathways in social settings. So right now we're going to ask you another question in the chat. What interests you about a decolonized approach to your work? So feel free to write in the chat, and we're going to give you our reasons right now. So for myself, I can say that in addition to this being part of a kind of bigger ongoing personal mission to make my work more equitable and justice oriented, I'm also interested because I genuinely think it makes my work better by expanding my perspective and worldview and thinking about things through a different lens. So for us, like we mentioned, we're just starting on doing this work ourselves, and we want to prioritize the voices directly of others who are much further along this road, people who don't look like us. But that doesn't mean that this work isn't ours to do as well. So people who look like us, we really want to acknowledge are part of this field. And in our experience, we make up the majority of highly paid consultants for philanthropy and international development work. We all need to be decolonizing our methods, leaning into non-Western ways of building shared knowledge. And we need to listen and learn from leadership of those who have developed these methods and articulate them based on generations of knowledge in their communities. Now, for me, this is my own personal thesis on the whole thing. The most important thing to keep in mind is that it's my responsibility as a privileged, white, well-connected American consultant not to learn a few decolonized methods, add them to my toolbox, and then charge a bunch of money off of them. That's actually a really colonizing and extractive practice, and we really need to think about avoiding that. Just like Jewlya mentioned earlier, that Western methods themselves can be extractive and colonizing, we really want to avoid that here. So rather, it's our responsibility to seek out, work with, and promote BIPOC futurists, including Afrofuturists, Indigenous futurists, and others whose perspective and context is necessarily, it's just different from mine. So partnering with these folks and or passing the mic is the best way we personally know how to stay back from that slippery slope of learning and then claiming the knowledge as our own. Such a strong habit and tendency in the Western mindset.
So for me, I'm leaning deep into the decolonizing of my methods because I've always held a commitment in my work to do no harm and to help as much as I can. So my mother was taught growing up that very white Midwestern US notion that you have to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. She was a single mom with 2 young children. She was going to college and she was trying to do exactly that when the federal government took away her child care benefit because of a policy change. At the same time, she was in an ethics class that transformed her thinking. It was teaching her to recognize that every single action we take, from driving a car to the career we pick to the policies that are passed, have the potential to help people or harm people. And these combined experiences shaped who she was and who she taught me to be. The notion that we need to actively seek not to cause harm, to question the decisions that are being made that harm others, and to look at how the larger systems are causing harm and seek to undo that. Now, to my dismay, I have come to realize the Western methods that I've been using for a long time now can feel and be quite elitist. I've also come to realize that they do harm. They have done harm. And I don't want to be someone who causes that harm. There are simply better ways to make a difference through my work. Jen?
Yeah, so thank you guys for those great comments in the chat. I like, oh, it's moving pretty quickly there, but using our privilege to enable others, ensuring our work reflects the needs of the community. Some really powerful thoughts there, and really appreciate that. So with that, we're going to go to another expert, another video. It's really important to actually note that some of the most exciting work in decolonized futures is being done here in the US with the strong justice orientation these days. So for the next 2 minutes, we're going to look at an example from Afrofuturism. And that was a picture of Janelle Monáe really demonstrating Afrofuturism. So this is from a California-based project by Dr. Lonnie Brooks. So Afrofuturism, as I mentioned, it spans literature, music, fashion, art, culture, and also social interventions that uplift humanity and participant perspectives. All right, so let's check out Dr. Brooks's video.
We all have agency over what the future can bring. Each of us individually can shape not only our personal future, but the future that we all live in. And the object of tonight is to get you to imagine. We want to get you to get out of the frame of reference of what you think your future might be and get as creative as possible. And we're going to see what we can build using that imagination and speculative thought. And we might come up with some cool stuff. So there are people who have tension cards. These tension cards are going to establish the parameters of our universe, and we're going to choose 2 cards. Let me see, raise your hand if you have a tension card. All right, all the way back there.
More or less Black feminist leadership.
More or less Black feminist leadership. Who else has a tension card?
More or less social justice.
More or less social justice. So now that we have the parameters of our universe, we have created 4 multiverses that we can live in, all along the spectrum of those 2 choices. So now you guys in your chairs, you have inspiration cards. All right, let me see. What is your inspiration card?
Oh, I have fashion.
Okay, fashion. I like this one. I like fashion. What would be an article of fashion that would give you more Black feminist leadership and more social justice? Yes.
I was just thinking about the notion of the invisibility cloak, but also like to have it be reversed. Like it could make you invisible, but it could also make you more visible, amplifying like what you normally.
So an amplification cloak. Go. A bodysuit. What does this bodysuit do?
Protects you from any kind of harm.
How about a bodysuit that repels emotional damage?
Oh.
Oh shit. Okay, here we go, y'all. Let's go. Let's go. So we have a bodysuit that when anything emotional tries to come and get you, it repels it. How could it be dystopian?
Dictators could use it.
That's
How so?
If you're not feeling emotional damage, then there's no consequence to society. So it feels like it could be a very negative thing to have a suit. that protects you from
Right.
all that.
So that could be dystopian. Okay, I need another inspiration, another object.
Inspiration, queer liberation.
Queer liberation. Object. Who has an object? Object. Here. Buttons.
You can press the button to change your gender.
A gender shifting button. Who's with that?
Yeah.
The button should be more like you're more on the spectrum. It's more fluid.
Yeah,
I think we're like post-binary.
It's not binary.
So what if the button is just like, it just regulates you through your queer liberation? It's a dial. It's not a button, it's a dial, right?
Research has shown that we can create alternative memories that heal trauma. And how do we heal the trauma of 400 years of oppression? How do we heal any personal trauma that we've had individually, collectively? And how do we create alternative memories of the future that pull us in and create resiliency for everybody? So we see this game as potentially available in schools, colleges. I played it with my students.
I like playing it with students also because, especially your students of your Afrofuturism course, they want to be creating their own cards and their own ideas that they're putting into the game. So it's not just using what we've given them, but adding to it.
Let it become a democracy of the future for everyone, available to everyone.
I just think this game is so cool. I hope you guys are excited about it as me. I wish we could play it. And we're going to ask you right now, actually, to post in chat. How might this game spark a different dialogue and lead to a different approach to a strategy or systems change efforts? I mean, it's really asking us to break down our assumptions about the future, to be bold, be creative, and to envision something that has just not been articulated before. So I'll just talk a little bit more about Afrofuturism while you're hopefully typing some answers. I got my start learning about Afrofuturism by reading Adrienne Marie Brown's book, Emergent Strategy, which is one of my must reads for those of you who want to engage with systems change strategies. So Afrofuturism teaches us that artists and social and technological innovators can use speculative futures to create a reality today that is nourishing, healthful, and inclusive. Many descriptions of Afrofuturism describe it as a long-standing tradition, having its roots in escaping historical and present-day oppression and trauma through both fantasy and realism. So sadly, the filmed murder of George Floyd put the very present-day horror and trauma of Black Americans on display for the world. And historically, as Dr. Brooks describes, traditional spirituals during enslavement were, quote, articulating Black visions of a future of uncolonized minds and bodies. This is a form of futurism, end quote. So as Dr. Brooks continues, actually forecasting is stronger, not weaker, when it includes the fullness of the forecaster. Stronger as advocate than as agnostic. So I really love that idea of advocate rather than agnostic for those of us who are focused on systems change. We know we're motivated by principles and our work is laden with values. So it's really important to keep in mind that we're not operating in a void, that what we do bring is our inevitable biases, along with our perspective to the work, along with unique roles to play in speaking truth to power. So Julia, was there anything in chat we should mention?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of comments about the opportunity to promote and positively benefit communities by using a game like this. I actually got to play the game with a group of nuclear weapons and climate change experts last year. And among many other futures, we discovered a future where migration pathways led to more and more people immigrating to African countries, and where these countries, grounded in their current values and beliefs, created a new way of measuring who to let in, to seek and open their doors, not to those with the most skills, as we have defined them, but those who have given back, who've shown they've been connected, to and in their communities, who have shown their care for others, a change in who we see as the most important for our communities. So let's keep moving into this foresight journey. If we haven't already made it clear, we're making a pretty simple argument here. Anytime you do strategy work or evaluation work, you're already doing futures thinking. Strategic plans, goals, objectives, outcomes, these are all predictions about the future. And foresight says, don't predict one future. Don't predict the future that you intend to create, but rather explore the relationship between the past, the present, and the future, and envision as many possible futures as you can, to challenge the complexity of the context, to assume you don't have control over the future, and to prepare for whatever comes. It belongs in systems change strategies. This notion that when we are doing work, that some mix of interventions emergent or planned, and our goal is to shift the behaviors and the institutions in a highly complex setting. We need foresight, because if we don't use it, we're going to assume linearity. We're going to forget about the concept of emergence and the uncertainty that we're working within. Now, if you're just starting your foresight journey, and you've got this deep commitment to equity that we're sharing here, the reality is that you don't want to use those Western methods. They're disconnected, they're difficult, they're elitist. And when we use a decolonized approach, when we pick an approach that is meaningful and relevant to the communities we're working with, the bias we introduce there is to create room for expertise of many types of participants to be centered. We also connect the complexity of the past to the uncertainty of the future. That's a really important one. It helps us understand the interconnected nature of everything from racism and other forms of discrimination to technology and culture, even spirituality, without siloing these distinctions into a set of drivers or outcomes or trends. And that is what Western methods typically do in foresight. Now, for the record, I am not saying the Western foresight experts can't do all of these wonderful things. And in fact, I know futurists who do a beautiful job of the different elements of what I've described, of developing these deeply intersectional and visionary futures. But what I am saying is that the Western methods themselves don't help you accomplish that. They don't help the power in the process be transferred. They don't help you decenter yourselves. The decolonized methods, they don't have to be all carefully handled to avoid repeating inequities in the way you have to do when you decide to use a Western method. With a decolonized method, you're not tweaking and pushing and pulling and figuring out how to make it meaningful with the communities you're working with. So we encourage you to begin your foresight journey, or if you're already on it, go straight into the decolonized approaches. They remind us, delve deeply into the knowledge and meaning-making processes that build on lived experience, draw on cultural insights we already hold about the future, challenge the trends we see today, instead of accepting them as patterns that will emerge tomorrow. Use your decolonized approaches because they shift the relationship between the strategist and the community. They create new stories that are compelling enough for us to try to pursue, because they remove the fallacy of seeing time as linear. And they help us see how our past, our myths, our metaphors, our stories, our experiences show up in our future. Okay, you have seen two practices, and now I want to explore one more. And in this one, it's a bit different. This is actually a set of core principles that can guide you in any decolonized futures practice. Pupelbish is a network weaver for the next generation foresight practitioners. And she's also the founder of Decolonizing Futures. She's the creator of wonderful resources and practices in this work. And she actually worked with us to cut and put together this video from one of her presentations, because she believes that strategists, researchers, and evaluators all have a role in using decolonized foresight methods in their practices.
In the context of my initiative,
see if we can make that work.
Therefore, I decided to give the power of both story creation and storytelling directly to the people who are participating. And as a futures researcher, I assumed the role of a listener. And in listening, my only job is to be respectful. And in listening, my only job is to be thankful for them to be sharing their stories with me. The second value, or the second principle, is totality versus destruction. A lot of times in discourses that come out of a Western worldview, we have this tendency to break things down in order to understand them. But when I was studying these non-Western cultures, specifically in how they understand and make sense of stories, the style of sense making is very, very relational. It's about connections. It's about reciprocity between different elements. So in this method, I understand, and when I work with people, we don't break their stories apart into constituent elements. We try to understand the story in its totality. The third one is comfort with diversity. Again, a very, very characteristic feature of non-Western storytelling was this comfort with diversity, right? So they're not so much obsessed about what the story is. In India, for example, no matter what the storytelling method, it's the same story that is being told for the past 400 years. What the audience, as well as the artists, are interested in is the interpretation of the same tale. So it's about how can I, by being a storyteller, tell the same story differently versus you as a storyteller. So they're very, very comfortable with multiple interpretations. There's no concept of one absolute truth. The fourth one is particularity versus universality. This one was really an eye-opener for me. Because I think something that I was struggling with is I want to be inspired by India, but I don't want to box my practice within just that one limited context. When we're trying to work with story or narrative, a mistake that we make is that we think that in order for it to become relatable to people, we start making the story bland. We start making it generic. We start taking out the specifics from the story. But the tendency of human nature is that the more particular the story, the more specific the story, the more real the story, the more human the story, the easier it will be for people to relate to that story. Because they will find some similarity between their human experience and that of the storyteller. The fifth one is constructive storytelling, something that comes out of peace educator Jessica Sinehi's work. So she proposes this incredible thing that I chose to include in my work, is that of constructive storytelling. How can we build more spaces to reject those destructive narratives and really start constructively talking about positive, more equitable futures and times to come? The second last one, not without my history. As futurists, we take so much pride in multiple futures and many possibilities. But we can't talk about alternative futures if we don't talk about alternative histories. We don't have a singular history, we do not have a singular present, and therefore, in order to authentically talk about alternative futures, we need to talk about alternative histories. And then the last one is power of orality. In the spirit of, and in keeping with the style of knowledge sharing, the style of instruction, the style of connection in many non-Western cultures, and it being oral, I decided to give importance or put in the forefront the oral form of expression in the method that I was designing.
Pupil offers us a way of thinking about a decolonized approach that I hope resonates with you. It's not a specific method. It's a set of principles that you can use in many different ways. And I find it personally to be pretty meaty stuff. Some of it maybe reminds you of things you already knew, but some of it definitely steps a little further than what we're trained to do. So I'm going to pose a question in the chat, which is for you to think a little bit about which of the principles you want to dig into with your work. One of the things I really appreciate about Pupil's principles is that they remind me to avoid one of the things I've been taught to do, to extract, to find the pattern, to generalize, to pull out, to find one story. It's really common in Foresight work to identify the set of drivers, trends, potential future outcomes or dynamics, and then bump them up against each other in order to envision the types of futures that may occur. And having done this many times, I'm actually struck by how different these descriptions of the future are from those that are constructed by understanding stories in their totality, by hearing the particularities of stories about the future, instead of constructing stories that are based on key elements and losing the nuance in the process. Jen, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Julia. I think for me, every time I hear this video, something else resonates. But for me today, I'm going to say number 4, particularity equals universality. I like that principle. It has my gears turning today. So, all right, at this point, you are maybe saying to yourselves, this stuff is super cool, Jen and Julia, but I have no idea how it's relevant to my work. So we want to give you a couple more examples. So lawyer, activist, and Afrofuturist Rashida Phillips has been using Afrofuturist methodologies in her work at the Community Futures Lab, amongst other places in Philadelphia, where residents of the gentrifying Sharswood-Blumberg neighborhood in North Philly envision inclusive and equitable futures as part of their interventions. So one example of a project that they ran there is a narrative collection, and they're collecting time capsule oral histories that are told from a future perspective of how the neighborhood evolved. So they're pretending they're in like 2050, and then they're collecting oral histories of how the community evolved since 2021. These narratives have been really powerful in holding up the rights, dignity, and lives of the community, in a community that developers have really written off and attempted to erase as Philadelphia's worst neighborhood. If you Google the neighborhood, that's what you'll see. They're trying to do, to create an alternate future in attempts to create alternative pathways of change and multiple understandings of the present, and present alternative desired outcomes that are all really, important to the people of the community themselves. And that's what's present in this oral history project. So there's an external audience within the city planners and developers, and the project really has that focus of trying to change the present right now. So if I were designing an evaluation of that intervention, which is one of the things that I do in my work, I could see myself using futures in a few ways for the evaluation of this kind of futures intervention. So I've already mentioned that my work sits at the intersection of complexity and equity. I see decolonized futures as a practice that really does encompass both. So decolonized is equitable, and futures is complexity aware and open to multiple pathways. So it's a really cool intersection of these two buckets of work, of complexity and equity principles. So maybe I could analyze those collected oral histories and compare them to city planning goals and highlight opportunities to realize citizens' wishes and the pitfalls to avoid. I could really look for the good matches and mismatches and use resident stories to speak that truth directly to power. Or maybe I could develop an alternative to a theory of change alongside Rashida's organization, one that's more liberation oriented, by asking the community to paint a series of murals depicting the future they'd like to see. Of course, in any of these instances, I'd be working from a culturally responsive perspective and not imposing my ideas onto the community, but instead working with Community Futures Lab to design an intervention where all of the components actually serve the community, from the strategy and the program design through to the implementation and the evaluation. So it shouldn't be extractive, as we've mentioned. It should be working in their language and highlighting their goals. So as Pupil said, new language has to come from new places. So one more thing to be clear, we're not saying that all decolonized methods are interchangeable. They really do have to be matched to the time and space. So in addition to Afrofuturism, Indigenous futurism is a growing movement here in the States and in Canada. The term was coined by Anishinaabe scholar Grace L. Dillon. And although Jewlya and I, neither of us have actually used it in our work yet, we're really keen to learn more and have provided some resources at the end of this presentation. Our colleague and the founder of Bowman Performance Consultant, Dr. Nicole Bowman, who is Mohican and Lenape, reminds us of the importance of moving our practice out of sterile and academic environments, and because those can be often trauma-filled for BIPOC, and back into the community and into natural contexts. So as Nikki has shared, Indigenous futurisms are not limited to a brain-only experience, and they really include connections with our other senses. So one last example is from the UK-based School of International Futures, who are working with the World Health Organization in the Western Pacific region to expand their understanding of what COVID means across various impacted communities. So this is part of the broader Next Generation Foresight Practitioners Project, which Pupilbisht from the last video is the network weaver for them. So the WHO in the Western Pacific region have recognized that a gap in understanding what young people from across the region think. So the project engages youth in 35 countries from Malaysia to Tuvalu via 75 young futurists from these countries, exploring what healthy futures look like. The project is making use of SenseMaker and a journaling exercise. And through qualitative and quantitative analytics, the WHO are seeing that organic visions for 2032 from across the region absolutely have relevance for the decisions that they're making right now. So in short, much like trends towards oral reporting and photo voice, decolonized futures methods can allow people to use their own words and communication style to discuss their challenges, successes, and their dreams. All right, so let's go back really quickly to that quote from Lonnie Brooks. Forecasting is stronger, not weaker, when it includes the fullness of the forecaster, stronger as advocate than as agnostic. So I just want to ask you one more question today. What are you most excited about from today's introduction to decolonized foresight? So write down anything that comes to mind in the chat. As Jewlya mentioned, we take the stance that all perspectives and methods are biased. And for us white consultants in particular, it's important to recognize our inherent bias and work to expand our ways of of understanding the world and gathering insight. So that's why we aren't offering the Western ways of knowing as a starting point. We're actually offering a different starting point entirely. It just avoids the risk of tweaking, of centering Western thinking and starting there and then making adjustments at the margins. That's something we want to avoid. So again, we hope that if you came to this presentation hoping to gain a set of marketable skills, that you really will consider what it means to colonize this type of work and think instead about how you can partner with, rather than capture income from, decolonized futurists as part of your business model, or when you're deciding who to hire. So we hope you will keep posting in the chat. And with that, I'm going to pass back to Jewlya.
Great, thank you. All right, did we catch your attention today? Are you ready to start decolonizing your futures? I hope so. We've pulled together a pretty wide array of decolonizing futures resources for you. We've been reaching out to experts in the field and we asked them what to include with these resources. We have a mix of compelling videos that introduce you to different contexts and practices. We have some practical how-to information. And the site also highlights many of the leading decolonizing futures practitioners. We very much hope that you reach out to them and lean into their ways of thinking. Also, one of the futurists we introduced you to today, Pupilbisht, is hosting a free training on a decolonized future storytelling method on October 14th. Check out the link in the chat for more information. And I'm going to be there. I hope I get to see some of you there as well.